Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan introduced us to a new class of starship, the first Starfleet ship in Star Trek not to be a Constitution class. The USS Reliant was the antagonist vessel, going up against the Enterprise in one of the franchise's best cinematic outings. But her inclusion raises a few questions. In this video, we will look at the Miranda-class starship. Designed by Joe Jennings, Mike Miner and Lee Cole, the Reliant filming model was only 3/4 the scale of the Enterprise model in order to make it easier to use. It was first intended to be similar to the Enterprise, an older, somewhat battered starship of the Enterprise class. Yet it was thought having two similar-looking starships fighting would be confusing for the audience, so a more radical approach to the design was taken. This new design was sketched out and sent to producer Harve Bennett for approval. When the sketches were returned, however, Jennings, Miner and Cole found that Bennett's signature was upside down. Interpreting this to mean that he had approved of the design only upside down, they turned the ship over, and so we got the catamaran look, along with a roll bar, which made all the difference. For a while, there was speculation as to the class name. One fan favourite was the Avenger class, a good name, if a tad too on the nose given the events of the Wrath of Khan. In at least one sourcebook for a Star Trek role-playing game, it was described as a Reliant-class research cruiser, a refit development of an earlier Anton class. The official class name eventually became Miranda, admired Miranda, said to be named for the daughter of Prospero in William Shakespeare's The Tempest. Oh wonder, how many goodly creatures there are here, how beauteous mankind is, oh brave new world that has such people in't. It may seem a very obscure reference for a science fiction spacecraft, but given the literary allusions that litter the Star Trek franchise, it is not implausible. The Tempest is a special case, in any case. It already had science fiction credentials in the shape of the 1950s classic Forbidden Planet, which took the play for its inspiration. A minor mystery concerning the Miranda class lies with the very first ship, the Reliant. Why is she called Reliant? It is a curious name to call your antagonist vessel, even if that ship has been hijacked. The word is an adjective, meaning to be dependent on someone or something. There tends to be meaning in the names of fictional ships, even if those names lend nothing to the story. Think of the New Jersey in the 3rd season of Star Trek Picard, a nod to the showrunner's year and place of birth. In Star Trek, starships have often been named for real ships, so perhaps we might find a namesake in the nautical world. There was a Royal Fleet auxiliary called Reliant that served the Royal Navy during the 1960s and 1970s. But this would be a very obscure reference. There is an American harbour tug called Reliant, but she was launched in 2009, far too late to be the inspiration. Moving away from ships, we can turn to other modes of transport. There was a single-engine aircraft called the Stinson Reliant. The American Plymouth Reliant was in production during the making of the Wrath of Khan. In Great Britain, we had the legend that was the Reliant Robin. What were the writers trying to say when they named the ship Reliant? And if there was no special meaning, no link to themes and motifs in the film, then why call her Reliant? The one thing the Reliant's design lacked was a navigational deflector dish. Given the longevity of this particular design addition to the Enterprise and other starships in the Star Trek universe, it seems a curious omission. And then there was the vertical intermix chamber of the Enterprise. If such a long vertical device is needed for warp speeds, then where is the space for it on the Reliant? We do partially glimpse a vertical intermix chamber on the smaller ship during the film, but this can only be 5 decks high at the very most. If a Miranda-class starship can travel at warp quite happily with a 5-deck vertical intermix chamber, then why does the Enterprise need one 14 or 15 decks high? On the subject of propulsion, the impulse drive and its impulse deflection crystal are very close together, closer than on the Enterprise in fact. There can't be much machinery between the two. And why is there a second crystal on the underside of the ship? Why does the Reliant and her sisters have two? The answer to the age of the Miranda-class is the same as that of the film The Wrath of Khan itself, as the Reliant was designed and the filming model built for the movie. In universe, though, it is less clear. It is said that the original series episode Court Martial suggests the Reliant herself was a contemporary of the classic series Enterprise. There is a display panel in this episode on which there are 10 hull registries. This data formed the core for a 1975 article by Greg Jen called The Case for Jonathan Doe's Starship. The 5th hull registry was given as NCC 1664 in the article, and does look to be NCC 1664 in the original episode. Others, however, say that the 5th hull registry is actually NCC 1864, the same hull registry later used by the USS Reliant. It would be odd if listed on the display there was a starship with a hull registry significantly higher than the Enterprise during this period in Star Trek, but let's assume the display does indeed say NCC 1864. It is conceivable that the Wrath of Khan production team watched Court Martial, saw the display and took the number. But the Reliant was initially intended to be a battered older starship, older than the Enterprise. A hull registry higher than the Enterprise would not support this idea. Of course, hull registries in Star Trek have never been very consistent. Just think of the USS Constellation. A Reliant of the 2260s would make the Miranda-class a very enduring design in universe. Whilst the Enterprise A and her sisters bow out of Star Trek with the end of the Undiscovered Country, the Mirandas proliferate in the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine eras, even as late as Voyager's return to Earth. Some of their hull registries suggest ships built long after the initial batch. Amongst the named ships, we have the Lantry, NCC 1837, the Brattain, NCC 21166, the Tiananmen, NCC 21382, the Majestic, NCC 31060, the Shirkar, NCC 31905, the Nautilus, NCC 31910, the Second Saratoga, NCC 31911, the Sitak, NCC 32591, and the Trial, NCC 1948, all post-original era Star Trek. If the hull registry in Court Martial is that of the Reliant, then the Mirandas lasted nearly a century and a half. There is no mention of a Soyuz class before the Next Generation 5th Series episode Cause and Effect. In that episode, we are introduced to the USS Bozeman, NCC 1941. It was going to be a new design, but budgetary constraints led to a redress of the Reliant filming model. Which came first, the Miranda or the Soyuz? The Soyuz class is said to have been withdrawn from service in 2288, sometime between the events of Star Trek V The Final Frontier and Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country. Given that the Enterprise is generally thought to be one of the first to undergo Starfleet's extensive refit program, any pre-refit Bozeman, assuming such a vessel existed, would have undergone the program after Star Trek The Motion Picture in 2271. A refit of the whole fleet would have taken years, if not decades, in universe and in the real world. The Bozeman disappeared in the region of the Typhon Expanse in 2278, so she was either on her first post-refit voyage or very nearly so. If the class was withdrawn only 10 years after the Bozeman's disappearance, then we might surmise the Soyuz starships were already of some antiquity. The Mirandas were still in use a century later, witness their presence as cannon fodder in Deep Space Nine. The Miranda's design might have been an improvement on an earlier class. Could that earlier class be the very similar Soyuz class? We could theorize that only a handful of Soyuz class were built as specialized vessels, that they were a development of the highly successful Miranda class rather than the other way around, and that the newer Soyuz were not successful and were withdrawn after only a decade or two in commission. And yet, given the conciliatory nature of 1960s Star Trek, it would have been fitting for there to have been a Constitution-class starship alongside a Soyuz class. The very American Constitution next to the very Russian Soyuz. Personally, I like the catamaran look of the Miranda-class. It is a good-looking design, more compact than the Constitution class with more space for shuttlecraft. It puzzlingly lacks a navigational deflector dish though. The question of the Reliant's age is one I can happily set aside. Perhaps the hull registry in Court Martial really is NCC 1864, rather than NCC 1664. It's fun to speculate what a pre-refit Reliant might have looked like. My rough recreation includes a deflector dish in place of the original filming model's torpedo complex, as it is a logical location. But who knows? You do look, my son, in a moved sort, as if you were dismayed. Be cheerful, sir. Our revels are now ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And, like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve. And, like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep.